This is Robert Sapolsky, and you're listening to Father-Offspring Interviews.
Hi there, folks. Welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews. To start today's episode, Conrad from Poland asks, is cheating observed in any of the pair bonding species? If yes, have we noticed any kind of repercussions for the delinquent?
Oh, what a salacious, prurient question there. Yes, this takes us back many episodes to this major contrast, this dichotomy between two different types of social systems in animals. What do you find in tournament species versus pair bonding species? Tournament species, we heard about back when, species where males mate with multiple females, females mate with multiple males, high levels of competition for reproductive access, high levels of aggression. Males do very little child care. They're mostly selected for big, muscular, secondary sexual characteristics. Then there are the pair bonders, the monogamous species, the ones who form monogamous pair bonds for life. And you see very different social systems with them. For one thing, if you're only mating with one individual, there's not a whole lot of competition as you see in tournament species. You see roughly males and females are the same size. Tournament species, males are a lot bigger than females, have bigger secondary sexual characteristics. Pair bonding species, low levels of aggression, often biparentalism, the male as well as the female taking care of the kid. Okay, so we have this basic dichotomy, and we've got the pair bonding, the monogamous species out there. And you see them in mammals and fish and birds and amphibians. I have a colleague who studies monogamous frogs and their biparentalism. You see it in spiders. There's at least one monogamous spider species. So, you got monogamy, you got pair bonding. How common is this? And the answer is it depends. If you look at mammals, less than 10% of mammals are pair bonders. You look at birds, and it's like 90% of them. Very, very common among them, among, for example, mourning doves, who are pair bonders in both the morning and the evening. Where does pair bonding, where does monogamy evolve from? One of the things that's clear is it evolved independently in a whole bunch of different lines of species. Three driving forces on monogamy. The one that is generally viewed as the most likely is you have an ecosystem where food is distributed in patchy resources. And thus you have females who establish territories around these patchy resources. They're scattered all about. And thus the males have this problem that they can't dominate mating with two females at other ends of the valley there. And so they settle for monogamy and stick around with one of them. The second driving force is when you've got species that are born sufficiently immature, sufficiently in need of parental care, that you get biparentalism. You need some paternal care as well as maternal. Third is many episodes ago, we talked about this phenomenon of competitive infanticide. A male will occasionally kill the infants fathered by a previous male and then take over the breeding group. And it's thought that monogamy may have evolved in some cases as a defense against infanticide. Okay, some elaborations on this animal monogamy stuff. In most cases, it is not lifelong, despite those swans who pine away for each other after their mate dies. Most cases, it's seasonal, and thus you get sequential monogamy. Although, as far as I can tell, you're not getting any of this polyamory crap. Okay, so within the world of monogamous species, there are all-stars. There is an all-star species, which is the prairie vole, which has gotten massive amounts of study and acclaim and operas and all of that, in part because it presents a very easy dichotomy. Once again, there's a prairie vole species running around Nebraska, and there's a mountain vole species running around Montana. And what you see is the mountain voles are tournament species, polygamous, polyandrous. The prairie voles are your textbook monogamous pair bonded species, and they stay that way for life, and they've been studied. And what's particularly interesting is people know exactly the neurobiological basis of how this works in them. In male brains, it's got something to do with the hormone vasopressin. More importantly, it's got something to do with the gene for the receptor for vasopressin. For those who care about these fine points in genetics, even more interestingly, it's got something to do not with the gene for the vasopressin receptor, but the promoter for it. In either case, if you are a prairie vole, male, you get more vasopressin receptors expressed in parts of the brain having to do with reward and anticipation and dopamine versus those polygamous mountain voles who don't have a whole lot of vasopressin receptors there. Male mates secretes vasopressin, and because there's more receptors in the pleasure centers, shorthand, in the prairie vole, it feels better and he is more reinforced by it and decides to stick around. It's as simple as that. And this gave rise to one of the all-time interesting studies, actually carried out by Larry Young at Emory University, where they took the promoter for the prairie vole vasopressin receptor gene and stuck it into the mountain vole version, substituted it in, and they made the mountain voles monogamous. And there was, of course, the question, did this represent gene transfer or gene therapy? Were you fixing mountain vole infidelities and such? Okay, so prairie voles, highly studied. Everybody knows about them. Everybody loves them. And along came two disastrous disappointments to the field. One of them, as referred to by Conrad in his question. First one, how do you keep track which one is the monogamous and which is the polygamous, the prairie vole or the mountain vole? And everyone I know in this business always had the same thing, which is they would think of Garrison Keillor's Prairie Home Companion, and it's incredibly Norman Rockwell-esque American prairie values and stuff. And that's how you would remember it's the prairie vole that's monogamous and has Thanksgiving dinners and everybody gets along and they quilt stuff. So the first disappointment, this association of prairie voles with the monogamy of Garrison Keillor and his radio program, Prairie Home Companion. Some years ago, it turned out that Garrison Keillor himself may not have been quite as much of a prairie vole as people thought. So that was the first crisis in the field. The second one was a bigger one, which is when you studied prairie voles, occasionally these pair bonding monogamous, there at each other's deathbeds voles from the prairies would go slip away and mate with somebody else. They would have extra pair bond copulations. And this was observed in both the males and the females. And this threw the field into a whole crisis. What are these prairie voles doing, cheating on each other? And this was extraordinary. And what was most extraordinary about it is it turns out that in lots of these monogamous pair bonding species, you get some of this messing around on the side. And this gave rise to a great split in the term pair bonding, monogamy, genetic monogamy versus social monogamy, or sexual monogamy versus social monogamy. And it turns out most of those pair bonding species are pretty sexually monogamous, but not entirely so, but they're socially monogamous. At the end of each day, they return to the same individual and tell each other about how their days were, and there's a stable, so which may not necessarily be sexually that pair bonded. So a lot of that has gone on, and that has caused all sorts of turmoil in the field. It's frequent in birds. Birds do a whole lot of this contrasting social monogamy with sexual monogamy. They fly off and they will do that sort of thing and cheat on each other. This introduced a word into the field, cuckoldry. Often, female birds will cuckold male birds, the male in their pair bond, because the rule is if you're a pair bonding species male, you're the one you mated with, gives birth, the one you think you mated with, gives birth, and you take care of the kids, and you put in all this effort. And in some pair bonding species, the males put in more effort on parental care than the females do. And what do you do as the females? Skip out on the guy and mate now with somebody else and get a second clutch of eggs. And the first guy is back there taking care of your kids and his kids while you go on and increase your reproductive success. So this occurs sometime. This also occurs in marmoset monkeys. You see pair bonding in South American monkeys. Marmosets, classic example. They mate for life. And as soon as the female gives birth, the male does more parental care than the female does, and totally devoted. And there is some female marmoset social monogamy versus sexual monogamy as well there. Okay, so this is interesting. This is interesting. And the question, of course, becomes, what are the repercussions of this? There's been enormous repercussions for the studying pair bonding species community, because this just ruined the whole perception of them as not merely socially monogamous, but oh, so much more than that. And this has been disappointing. As far as we can tell, though, you don't get any of this, like, there's no cuckolding marmoset who's saying stuff like, if only you had been more affectionate and listened more to my blathering, I wouldn't have needed to do this. That seems not to be the case there. So not a whole lot of counterfactuals. With the birds best studied, there seem to not be a whole lot of repercussions. Why? Because while the male is off cheating in his socially monogamous example, the female often is as well, because the males are being non-monogamous with other females, with females who are being non-monogamous. It seems as if there's just this sort of bubbling underneath of tournament species-like behavior in a lot of these pair bonding species.
Next, Gregory from Texas says, I have a question about visceral fat in obese people. It is known to cause low-intensity chronic inflammation. Why does it happen, and for what purpose? What is the evolutionary reason why this property has developed?
Well, among the fat obsessives, the discovery that fat can get inflamed was as shocking as monogamous prairie voles not being all that monogamous. Fat is made up of fat cells, also known as adipocytes, although I think they're called adipocytes in those countries where they misspell words like color and behavior. So you got adipocytes, fat cells making up fat tissue. In addition, you got to get blood in there. So you've got vascular cells, you got capillaries, and fat turns out to be highly vascularized. It needs a lot of blood. So those are part of clumps of fat. You get cells that can turn into adipocytes, but are still in a sort of dormant pre-state called pre-adipocytes. So all that's great. But then people discovered that also within fat, you get inflammatory cells, cells associated with inflammation, for example, macrophages. And this was like completely shocking to everyone. Why is there inflammation? Why does fat have the capacity to become inflamed? Because that's what people soon saw. And this was utterly puzzling and brought up exactly these questions. What's it good for? How did it evolve? And to appreciate it, I think we have to look at three different states as to what your fat tissues could be going through. First one, you are lean. You don't have much fat. And you don't have that many adipocytes, and the ones that are there are not that big. They tend to be fairly small, and they're just going about their business of storing fat in response to insulin signals and mobilizing it in response to signals like adrenaline, epinephrine, and just going about things. And every now and then in your perfectly happy, lean, fat tissue area, a fat cell will die. These things happen in every season. It dies, it undergoes a type of programmed cell death. And what that does is give a signal for the local inflammatory cells to come and just eat it up and get rid of the debris and just clean up the gunk there. So this is this very steady state in lean fat tissue. And what you see is inflammatory cells release all these chemical messengers that trigger inflammation, and they're called pro-inflammatory cytokines. And what people were puzzled by was that these inflammatory cells release as many of anti-inflammatory cytokines. What's that about? During an inflammatory response, you turn on the pros, and after a while, you turn on the anti-inflammatories to take you back down to baseline. In lean fat, the inflammatory cells are dominated by the anti-inflammatory signals being released there because nothing's happening. Let's just be quiet. Okay, so second state. Second state, you're putting on weight. Oh, our Western crisis of obesity, putting on weight is totally normal for mammals. You look throughout the animal world and you see drastic differences in the amount of body fat, depending on if it's dry season or wet season, depending on if you're about to go into hibernation or coming out the other end of it. Fat storage potential in the body is very, very labile, is very, very changing by circumstance. In human studies, I think in West African agriculturalists, showing that each year the contrast between right after harvest and 6 months earlier, there's a change of about 20% of body weight, which is a big change. So totally normal to put on fat stores at certain times of years if you're a mammal. So how does this occur? Two ways. The first one is the adipocytes that are already there get bigger. They become hypertrophied. The cells get bigger. They structurally get a lot bigger, thousandfold increase in the volume of some of these cells. And what also occurs is a little bit when they're getting a whole lot bigger, they give out a signal to those pre-adipocytes to become adipocytes. So what you mostly have are bigger fat cells and a little bit of an increase in the number of fat cells. So what's going on with inflammation during that period? Something very subtle. So what's your inflammatory system pretty good at? Going in and blowing apart cells that are diseased or old or infected or what. And in addition, cleaning up the debris afterward, just as I was mentioning before, inflammatory cells are very good at scarfing up remnants of dead cells. So it turns out, under normal circumstances, those same inflammatory cells and their mediators do something much more subtle. They clean up little bits of debris from little parts of cells rather than the whole dead cell. And a great example of this has been shown in the nervous system, where you got synapses connecting the axon terminals of one neuron to the dendritic spines to the next. And what you see is, under some circumstances, you form new dendritic spines and axon terminals and form a new synapse. And in some cases, you disconnect them if you're not using them much. And when you disconnect them, you got these useless, and along come inflammatory cells and snip off the ends of these. As normal function in a non-inflamed brain, you make use of the inflammatory system, very, very quietly voiced, going about getting little bits of subcellular debris. And back now in fat cells, when they're undergoing a massive expansion totally normally during the wet season after a harvest, whatever, normally the structure of fat tissue is held together. There's all the cells, and then there's a whole superstructure, a whole matrix that holds all the cells together, an extracellular matrix. And when everything's increasing in size, you got to remodel your extracellular matrix. So you make use of the inflammatory cells to come in there and chop up some of this extracellular matrix, because then you have to rebuild it in a different conformation, making accommodations for now much bigger fat stores. So that's a great reason to have inflammatory cells in your fat cells, because under normal weight gain, it's part of just the remodeling you need to do to make things work. But then along comes our third circumstance, which is not normal weight gain for normal annual fluctuation, but instead obesity, the scourge of the West, increasingly the scourge of the developing world as well. What goes on? Same deal. Your adipocytes become really enlarged and they get the pre-adipocytes to join in, but it keeps happening and they get more and more expanded. And what you get is something called cellular stress, the actual architecture, the structure of the inside of these fat cells is getting all messed up because it's bulging out and ready to burst. Those of you who remember ninth grade biology, what you do is you get damage and stress to your endoplasmic reticulum. It's expanding so much, it's beginning to fall apart there. And thus, that adipocyte sends out a signal to the inflammatory system saying, help, I'm dying, I'm about to burst. Come have an inflammatory response to scarf me up. And then you get the usual problem with inflammation, which is it comes in and it targets this falling apart, bloated cell, but it also scarfs up some of the neighboring ones that are still doing okay. It overshoots, which is the problem with inflammation. Not only that, the inflammation in the fat cells now spill out into the rest of the body. Inflammatory cells in the rest of the body migrate into the fat cells, and you're just getting all these innocent bystanders being blown out, and you get all sorts of inflammation. You get what are called senescent zombie cells there that don't actually get degraded, but they take up space and they're not functional. All of that's a problem. There's another problem as well, which is back during normal annual putting on of weight as your fat tissues get bigger. And think about the scale of this, like 1,000-fold increase in the volume of these cells. It's not like you get all excited and exercise a lot over a weekend and your heart muscles increase their volume 1,000-fold. This plasticity in fat tissue is really unprecedented. So you're getting normal putting on of fat tissue gets a whole lot bigger. What do you need? You need more blood vessels getting in there because you got to feed in more nutrients. So you undergo this process called angiogenesis, which is the growth of new blood vessels. So that's part of the normal stuff. Now we're looking at the obesity scenario, and the cells are expanding at such a high rate that it outstrips the angiogenesis. It outstrips the development, the growth of new blood vessels into there. And thus, these greatly enlarged fat cells aren't getting enough oxygen. They're getting hypoxic. They're getting blue in the face. They're getting light. And that just adds to the inflammation also. And the whole thing spills over. After a while, the inflammatory macrophage cells, they try to help out a little bit. They take up little fat droplets coming out of the fat cells leaking out of there, and thus you get fatty droplets and macrophages. And I'm not exactly sure what the consequences are of that, but that can't be good, and it sounds sort of unsettling. So we've got the world of lean fat tissue where the inflammatory cells just help out a little bit now and then, are mostly turned off. We've got the world of normal annual weight gain where inflammatory cells are helping to do this sort of side skill that they have, which is to just remodel stuff rather than blow apart cells. And then we've got our pathologic world of obesity, of putting on weight to an extent that is not normal. What do we got? We got a word that comes out in every one of these discussions of westernized medicine, which is we have an evolutionary mismatch, which is to say that inflammatory cells and fat cells in fat tissue did not evolve in order to do full blast inflammation like when you've twisted your knee or something. In fat tissue, they've evolved to do this little remodeling stuff. And this is like this delicate little stuff they could do on the side, and very adaptive. And that's what it evolved for. And it's only in very recent human history that there's the capacity for morbid obesity to have the inflammatory system be activated way more than it evolved to be in fat tissue. Okay, one final domain of fat, which is all fat is not the same. And in the original question, the question was about the knowledge, the known fact that there's inflammation in visceral fat. Visceral fat. This is often called truncal fat, fat in your trunk, abdominal fat, and is most typically contrasted with gluteal fat, fat in your rear end. There's also subcutaneous fat under your skin, but let's ignore that. So you've got abdominal fat versus gluteal fat. Also in the field is often referred to as when you've got abdominal fat, you wind up looking like an apple. Whereas when it's gluteal fat, you wind up looking like a pear. So apple versus pear obesity. And one thing that is clear in the field is if you get a choice in the matter, you want to be a pear. You want to deposit your fat in your gluteal fat stores rather than your abdominal. How come? Because abdominal is less healthy for you. Abdominal fat is wrapped around all your internal organs. So all the inflammatory stuff that goes on there with obesity, when there's spillover into the neighborhood, it's spillover into your organs rather into the other half of your butt. Moreover, you find a whole lot more inflammatory cells in abdominal fat than gluteal fat. And what's that telling you? Normal fat storage is the wet season, dry season. You typically put on abdominal weight rather than gluteal weight. One last deal there, stress. Stress increases fat deposition, preferentially in your abdominal fat, in your apple fat, and that's worse for your health. And those fat cells are more sensitive to glucocorticoid hormones. So we've got normal leanness, we've got normal putting on weight, and then we've got this recently invented world of westernized pathologic obesity, where you see that the inflammatory roles in fat cells that evolved 100 million years ago are suddenly being pulled into a totally novel domain that they weren't evolved for.
Wrapping up is a question from India. Can animals and birds lie, or do only humans have the ability to lie? Supposing that animals can lie, under what circumstances?
Well, animals are not looking great in this episode. First, we had them as cheating, lying varmints, and now we got them as lying, cheating varmints. Can animals lie? Long debated. Can humans lie? You betcha. And all sorts of speculations about the evolution of language and humans. Why did language evolve? What else is there to do around the campfire each night other than gossip? It serves a very important social glue role there. But more importantly, what language allows humans to do is lie. Because language, words, arbitrary sounds that are disconnected from the meaning, it allows you to place a distance between the message and the messenger. And in that arbitrary space, there's room to lie. And you don't see this in other animals. Sometimes you get urban folk tales about this. Coco, the gorilla, who ostensibly was wildly fluent in American Sign Language, and by all more sober reports was far from that. At least two anecdotes about Coco lying, which, if they are to be believed, show that it's not just us. In one case, being a gorilla, she was in a somewhat churlish mood and she pulled the sink off a wall. And the humans came in and said, "Who did this? Who did this?" And Coco said, "The cat did it." On one other occasion, Coco, being a gorilla, did something else very gorilla-like, which is she ate a house plant. And they came in and said, "Who ate the house plant?" And she accused the grad student, which is sort of a time-honored tradition in labs. If something goes wrong, and people always accuse the first-year grad student, but these are only urban legends about Coco. Actual animals out in the real world, they don't lie because they are not able to put a space between the message and the messenger, between the meaning and the abstract way it's presented. And the reason for that is that animals don't present communicative information abstractly. What do I mean by this? Okay, you are a frightened human and someone menacing is attempting to frighten you. And we've got all sorts of ways. If you're poker faced and you've got good control over the blood flow to your cheeks and where your eyes look and what you say and what you don't say in your body language, it is not hard for a human to effectively pretend that they're not afraid, for example, in a circumstance where they really are. What happens in an animal instead? Take a dog that is afraid. What does it do? It releases fear pheromones, predominantly from its anal glands. What are fear pheromones made of? Are they made of some arbitrary molecules? No, they are molecules that tell you about stress. A lot of these fear pheromones are derivatives of stress hormones. If you were a dog and you're being stressed by being afraid by some big, scary other dog there, and you're giving off pheromones, they're going to be made up of stress hormone derivatives. You're telling the world, I'm stressed. I'm stressed by this. I'm afraid. You can't lie. But dogs attempt to lie because they can't change the chemical composition of the pheromones, the fear pheromones they're releasing. They at least make an attempt to stop the release of the pheromones. What do you do if you're that dog? You put your tail between your legs. You try to shut off those anal glands releasing. That's dogs attempting to present themselves as less afraid than they actually are. So the dogma always had been humans lie, no other species can. But you look more closely, and there's all sorts of versions of other species lying. Some of the time, it's lying in a metaphorical sense. It's just anatomical. You got species that can camouflage themselves. You got species that could mimic some other species that's a lot scarier than them. You got species, butterflies where on their wings, a coloration pattern looks like big terrifying eyes. You can have an anatomical lying. You're a male baboon and you're trying to see big and unafraid and threatening to some other guy, and you pilo erect the same muscles in our skin that gives us goose flesh, and a baboon makes the hair stand on end. They suddenly seem a whole lot bigger. So anatomical deception along those lines. You can look like a twig. You could look like another species that's scary. You can look like you have big scary eyes. You can look like you're bigger than you actually are, or you can look like you have some interesting appendage, angler fish. Those are those deep sea nightmare fish that were in Finding Nemo, where they have a little appendage that comes off their foreheads and has a little bit of sort of tissue thing that knocks around in there, and other fish are attracted to it thinking it's a worm or something, and they come up close and they angler fish. So you got lying. Ooh, I don't really have a worm on a fishing rod coming out of my forehead. All sorts of deception that's anatomical. Then there's deception that involves behavior that could be very fixed, very motoric. People in the business call them fixed action patterns, where there's not much learning involved. Where, for example, you get an organism that's about to be pounced on by a predator, and it makes use of the same advice we get with respect to some bears, should they be attacking us, which is the animal falls over and pretends it's dead. It plays possum, and possums do this, and other species do as well. And when you look at pictures of possums playing possum, they always have these hideously, ghastly, disfigured by death and decay expression on their faces. Snakes do playing possum. What is it about? Combination of two things. The first one being there's a lot of predator species that don't eat dead stuff, so that's a good way to be left alone. The other is there's a lot of predator species that key in on movement for seeing that there's a prey species. They're frogs, for example. They've got very cool eyes, but their eyes don't see in the sense that we do. Their eyes are attuned. They have these special ganglionic cells in their retina that are edge detectors. They could pick up a moving edge if they can pick up movement, a fly flying around. So both on a sensory level and on a yuck, who wants to eat something dead, playing dead, being immobile can be a form of deception. Okay, but it gets fancier than that. And here's where we get into the realm of animals perhaps having conscious strategies of deception. And to appreciate this, we have to return a week ago, 2 weeks ago, the question of consciousness, what it's good for. It begins to seem that animals that have rudimentary sense of consciousness can use it for manipulation, for social exploitation, for social smarts. Now, this goes back to the work of a guy named Donald Griffin, one of the most respected ethologists of all time. He was this grand figure who not only did great, elegant experiments, but was a philosopher king. This is what Donald Griffin's senior thesis was at Harvard in the 1930s. He discovered bat echolocation. And he just went on from there. Amazing scientist. And he was a naturalist in terms of the respect and general sort of austerity of him. He was kind of a cross between a pope and a bristlecone pine sort of thing. He was just vastly respected. And then in his old age, he did something interesting and unexpected, which is he had just spent his whole life doing things like as a bat flies and the wind bends its ear down, how does the vestibular organs in there compensate for the ear bending and how many degrees of deflection? And this is what he had been spending decades doing, beautiful stuff. And suddenly, in his old age, he said, hey, you know, maybe animals are aware and maybe they're doing much more interesting stuff than we usually give them credit for. And maybe we should have been studying that all along. And he wrote a small book in his old age called The Question of Animal Awareness. And two-thirds of the field said, oh my God, did you see that book that Griffin just published? Oh, he used to be such a rigorous scientist. What happened to him? And the remaining ethologists looked at this and said, this is totally inspirational. And he started a new subfield that is now called cognitive ethology. What is the sensory world? What is the cognitive world like for other species? Are they thinking? Are they thinking flexibly? Are they thinking strategically? Are they thinking in a way that shows that they can even think about what other individuals do? This fostered just a gigantic field of research. And out of that came two domains where it looked as if one was seeing conscious, aware deception on the part of some animals. Now, I know everybody here uses the word paratrepsis in an everyday sense, but some etymology as to where it comes from. We'll all say, oh, you giving me that warm fake smile. I know what you're up to, you paratreptic grifter, you. It actually is a term from ethology, which is manipulative deception. Animals are capable of manipulative deception. And there's two great bird examples that came out of this cognitive ethology revolution of Griffin's. And the first one was, you are a bird, you're a mourning dove. You've got a nest there, you got their eggs, and there's something scary around, like a fox that wants to eat your eggs, or a vulture, or a raptor, or some such big scary bird thing, and it's swooping around. And what you want to do is make it unclear where your eggs are. Birds will now go and seemingly nest in an entirely different place. They'll nest 100 yards away. They'll just sit down and they'll preen like they're nesting, and they will deceive the predator to think this is where the eggs are. And the predator will come over there, and the bird then quickly flies away, and the predator discovers there's no eggs there at all because they're over. So deception of this sort. The other type of deception, the other type of paratreptic behavior on the part of birds is incredibly cool as well. The broken wing behavior. You get a bird and it's near its chicklings, its ducklings, its babies, or its eggs or something, and there's some predator around, and you, the bird, are worried that it's going to find the eggs and eat them. And here's what you do. You suddenly take your wing and you fold it up at some horrible deformed angle, and you do the same thing with a leg of yours, and you start walking around and you're limping and you try to fly and you can't. And what does a predator think? Oh my God, look at that bird with a broken leg and a broken wing, and it looks totally vulnerable. So forget the eggs. I'm just going to follow the bird now. And the bird, doing this deception, limps around and crawls to the far end of the field just as the predator is coming close. And then the bird flies off perfectly fine. And with this broken wing display, it has led the predator away from where the eggs are. So that's totally great. The epitome of animal deception, though, comes when you're seeing flexible cognitive strategies that will change depending on the circumstance. One of the great realms of cognitively flexible deception comes from corvid birds, birds like crows and ravens and jays. And many, many episodes ago, we talked about how unbelievably scary smart corvids are and how there's some aspects of their brain anatomy that puts them up in that league. They can plan for the future. They could do gaze following from a human. Chimps can't do this. A human looks at a food source that the jay can't see, and after the human walks away, the jay goes over to where the human was looking. They can figure that out. They're super smart. As somebody in the field, Nikki Clayton, University of Cambridge, who's done much of this work, she refers to corvids as feathered apes in terms of their intelligence. And they can do some very clever, deceptive stuff. So you were a crow, and I believe the one that's been studied the most are from New Caledonia, off in the South Pacific, the New Caledonian crow. And what it does is it gets some seed thing and it wants to hide it somewhere so it can come back for it later. And it will cache seeds all over the place. It will cache seeds in 100 different locations in a field. And then later, when it's hungry, it will come back and dig them up from where it left it. Ooh, maybe it's just like manically digging up everywhere in the field. And people have done these studies showing something akin to traveling salesman optimization. The crow will go from one spot to another and not make a whole lot of false digging attempts. It remembers where it could remember where it left 100 little seed food sources piled away for the winter. So here's where the deception comes in. Take one of these crows, and it is caching away food sources, these seeds, and there's another bird, another crow there that's been put there by the researchers watching it. And what does our first crow have the cognitive flexibility to do to know, well, I would steal the seeds if I had a chance. And this bird knows where I'm putting them. It understands that bird has information about where you are caching, where you are hiding your seeds. And at that point, you take away the observer bird, and the first bird goes and digs up all the ones that it buried when it was being observed and puts them in a new place. Now put in a different bird, a second observer that didn't see where any of the stuff was put. And this bird doesn't change its behavior. It knows the difference between an observer who observed when I was hiding the stuff and an observer at any other point. And the one other requirement for crows to be able to do that is if they themselves have pilfered, have stolen buried seeds from places, because they then can say, aha, if I were that bird who's observing, I'd be keeping track because I would come back later and steal this. And it remembers now, and I now have to move the stuff. So deception of a cognitively extremely flexible way. And of course, the epitome of it comes from those unfeathered apes, which are apes. And chimps, I believe we've talked about, can do theory of mind, can show they understand another individual has knowledge that they don't, that they have information that the other individual doesn't have, and can act accordingly, can act strategically. And a great example of this is seen in circumstances. You take a chimp and you put a piece of food in a hiding place, and there's another chimp there. And under one circumstance, the other chimp can look through a translucent screen, can see where the food is being hidden. In another case, the screen is opaque. It can't look through it, so it doesn't see where it's being. And at that point, this chimp's behavior is completely different. If it was translucent, if he knows the other chimp saw where it was, he quick tears over to get the food before the other chimp. If it's opaque, the chimp will go and examine a different corner at the far end of the room, and this guy will now come and check out there, and our guy quick goes and gets the food. He understands what the other chimp knows and doesn't know, if and only if, just like with these crows, the chimp has had experience before at telling the difference between screens you can see through and screens you can't. If he already understands that, he could now understand what that chimp does or doesn't know and act accordingly. And if need be, act deceptively to try to lead the chimp off in the wrong direction. So that's totally great. And that's the landmark of theory of mind in chimps. But what people always said was, there's two limitations in this. First off, you can only get chimps to show they're doing theory of mind if they're really motivated, like they want to get some food. So it is not a constant cognitive ability they have. It is one that takes a lot of motivation. And the other is they're not able to demonstrate what's called secondary theory of mind, which is to know what that individual knows that's different from that individual to make sense of their behavior. What does the chimp care? It's just like, it's what's in it for me. If there's no food in it for me, I don't bother trying to do theory of mind, let alone some reason for secondary theory of mind. But a recent paper in PNAS, Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, showing very interestingly, chimps can do that as well. In this case, you take a chimp who's had experience with either a translucent screen, an opaque screen, and understands the difference, and it gets to watch two other individuals going through that same experiment of food being hidden. And this chimp can see whether it's translucent or opaque and understands. And in those circumstances, this chimp can do secondary theory of mind. It understands what this one knows and this one doesn't, and what this one should do strategically. How do you show that? Not where this chimp runs over to grab the food. Keep track of where the chimp looks. And if the chimp knows this chimp knows where the food really is, this chimp's eyes will go and look at that. Otherwise, it will go look off at some other corner. It understands what both of these other chimps do and don't understand, and it's got no stake in this. It's got no skin in the game. It doesn't care what happens, but just out of sheer voyeurism, it's willing to use this flexible cognitive ability to watch other chimps and whether or not they can be good liars or not. So we are most certainly not alone in that regard.
That's it for episode 79. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of Science and the Beard.